Okay, so welcome everybody to the Union Square annual walking tour. We've been doing these tours each year in Union Square. This is the Historic Preservation Commission in concert with the Somerville Arts Council, who are the financial sponsors for this. And the reason being is because Union Square has so much rich architecture here. And as you probably all know, the Green Line is coming, the good news. But the flip side of that is that's going to bring a lot of change to the square. So many of us in the city want to make sure that we keep a blend of the old and the new, and that we preserve those parts of Union Square that is important to people and that says something about its history. So we've been doing these tours in order to be able to let people know what are some of the really important buildings here, why. That's what Ed's role to do. Also, we would like input from you folks. We want to inform as well as get feedback. So today, don't feel shy about asking questions about what's going on if you're curious about certain things. Most of the buildings we're going to look at today have not been actually designated historic. There is a proposal actually for Union Square Local Historic District. It will be coming forth sometime in the near future. I can't say exactly when. And that would be to designate particular buildings and to establish particular areas where we feel they're very significant buildings that should therefore go through the Historic Preservation Commission for review and consideration before they take action. If you're a designated building in the city, that means that in fact the Commission has purview only on the exterior of the property and only those features that are not reversible, and only what's viewable from the public way. So there'll be lots of parts of a building in the rear, for example, that we don't say anything about as well. And the purpose of the Preservation Commission is not to be a very nasty, restrictive, hard-nosed group of people, but rather one that wants to work with the property owners to help them understand what are the important features of their building that gives it significance. Some of the buildings we'll look at today, you're going to have your rose-colored glasses on to appreciate why they might have been under consideration, because they've been altered over time. But as I said before, if things are not irretrievably altered, then we're hopeful that we can work with a property owner to suggest some changes if they want to make them. No one is forced to make any changes. So, now people have other questions as we go along, so that's just sort of broad overview. For those of you that don't know me, because you've been on other tours or other things, I see a lot of familiar faces, which is great. My name is Brandon Wilson, and I am the head of the Historic Preservation Commission. Actually, the person that drafted the legislation that established the commission, so I've been with the city since the dinosaur days, as my sons would say. I have asked Ed Gordon to be doing these tours with us because he has done a lot of surveying work with me over the years of a lot of properties throughout the city. So he's not only knowledgeable about Union Square, but lots of other sections of the city as well. So I'm going to let him do most of the talking today. I will give you some perspective sometimes on more of the city planning aspects of things and what's coming up, because I'm a city planner by background. And so I'm going to let Ed start off by telling you a little bit about Union Square. Yep. Historically. Ed Gordon, just so you know, if you didn't already read what I said in the flyer, actually is very knowledgeable not only about Somerville, but the whole Boston metropolitan area. And the reason for that is because he is also the president of the Victorian Society in America, the New England chapter. Right, let's be clear, he's not out in California. He also works in Arlington at the Schwab Mill, and at some point he'll probably make some entreaties for you to go over there and see him there, because it's a wonderful mill in Arlington. That is, well, I won't go into that now. So Ed, why don't you get started?
Okay, I hope you'll take a look at the handouts. If you haven't gotten some of the handouts, I'll later on in the tour make sure you get them. One is related to what the Victorian Society is up to this fall, and the other two relate to an exhibit that opens at the Mill next Saturday on the Mill Brook, which even a lot of Arlingtonians don't know that it's in Arlington, but you can see quite a bit of it. And we're looking at the 9 mills that used to be along the 3 Mile Brook. And then there's also an invitation to the Mill's second annual Oktoberfest, with beer provided by Aeronaut Brewery of Somerville. So last year we didn't know what to expect. We thought maybe 200 people. We had close to 900 people at that event. So we're excited to offer it again on Saturday, October 13th. So today we're looking at sort of the southwestern corner of Union Square. And the heart of Union Square is the Washington Street, Somerville Avenue crossroads. And we're talking about colonial highways that were set out in the 17th century, and over time they became host to commerce and industry, but not without a period from about 1800 to 1850 or 60 where you had a collection of Greek Revival wooden houses around the Union Square crossroad that very quickly during the Civil War and after gave way to commercial blocks and industry a couple of blocks away, which we'll get to. So part of historic Milk Row runs through Union Square, the major traffic artery that encompass Somerville Avenue and Washington Street, that in the late 18th to the mid-19th century was a very important route for Middlesex County farmers to bring their farm products, dairy products, into the markets of Charlestown at City Square and ultimately to Faneuil Hall and later Quincy Market in Boston. So Somerville at first was kind of a pass-through for commercial activity. It was part of Charlestown until as late as 1842 when it became the independent town of Somerville. And this independence was helped along by the fact that it was no longer just the hinterlands and the land beyond the neck and the farming and all of that, but it was starting to have an identity of its own thanks to the railroads coming in between 1835 and 1845, the Boston and Lowell Railroad down at the eastern end of Union Square, the Fitchburg Railroad that comes in 1842 along the south side. And so, you know, what do the railroads spawn? They spawn industry along their lengths. And so even before the railroads, the Middlesex Bleachery and Dye House gets started along Somerville Avenue at what is now Conway Park. All of those buildings are gone now, but that company was formed in 1820. It was one of the first industries in America to have steam-powered equipment, and it was in business until as late as 1936. So that's pretty remarkable. And then later on, along comes the Union Glass Works, very, very major. The 1850s was a big decade for industry getting started. Union Glass, American Tube. There's the Hamlin and Kingman wooden pump factory, which is actually a lot smaller than some of the other factories, but it's kind of, it exemplifies some of the smaller companies, factories that also got started in the area. So now let's turn our attention to Bow Market here, which I'm hearing opened in May of 2018. Is that right? So this is this year, very, very new, opening in circa 1920s concrete block, former garage and storage facilities that happen to sit on the exact footprint of a stables, the Albert Sanborn stables that go back to the early 1870s. And so this forecourt that we're standing in, this was the, where the Albert Sanborn carriages were turning around and being loaded with stuff, and people going in to pay the cost of renting the horse-drawn cart and things like that. And Sanborns are really synonymous with Union Square. They go back practically to the time of the Revolution. As a family, they're synonymous with this area. And they also, part of the family, owned a very prosperous brickyard at one point. So
let me just say something about the Bow Market. Yeah.
Do you want to say anything now about what it's like?
Yeah, exactly. So for those of you, have people been to Bow Market? Have people been to Bow Market before? Okay. So for those of you that haven't been here before, it's the first time, and that's one of the reasons we wanted to start here, because it is fairly new and innovative and a little difficult to find because it isn't actually on Bow Street, which I think confuses a lot of people. But it's a pretty exciting new concept that, once again, Somerville is pioneering in, I think. Not only is it because of the conversion, but the type of space that it was before, which is, Ed just mentioned, was basically open area. Oh, this one too, sorry. Okay. Also because this was a stable area before and then a parking lot, and for those people that might remember, Riverside Kawasaki used it for warehousing and such. So it was not a particularly attractive, inviting place before, and contrary, you can look around now and it's exactly the reverse. So it's also exciting because in Somerville, as everybody knows, real estate values keep going up and up, stratosphere, and this is affecting not only people that want to live here, but also people that want to do business here, whether as a new business or to stay here. So we're doing everything we can in the city to try and help that process along, and with the help of some developers who we've been working with. The two young men that have started this actually had this idea. Zach Baum and Matt Boyes Watson got this idea some time ago to make it so there's affordable space here for a lot of new businesses. So there's 30 plus spaces, I guess, that are very small. But the idea is if you're a startup business and you have a new concept that you want to try and make a go of and such, you can rent space here pretty inexpensively. And obviously you get the benefit of all the other people that are around you as well. And it's both eateries as well as people selling retail type merchandise, some of which they've made themselves. And so it's a pretty neat idea for a lot of the kind of startup businesses that otherwise don't have a way to get going. So some of these places are actually established, most are not, they're new, and we'll sort of see where they go. Remnants, the brewery, is also kind of fun because it is a brewery after noontime, but all day long, starting in the morning, it's a good place to get your coffee. So it covers basically all the hours that you might want in food. Yesterday we had Fluff Festival. Did anybody go to Fluff Festival yesterday? Okay, so that's a kind of another crazy Somerville festival, celebrating marshmallow fluff. For those of you that grew up on it, I don't need to say anything more, but anyway, they use this as part of the site that they use, and it was totally filled to the brim with people just, enjoying the food and just the whole atmosphere and such. So this really adds to Somerville, to Union Square specifically, and we're very excited to start you off here, and hope you'll come back.
Okay, so let's head out that way. This is kind of like the second part to my introduction. The tour, a lot of this is about the changing appearance of the landscape. And there's been a lot of changes along this stretch of Somerville Avenue going way, way back. If you're familiar with Somerville history, you may know that Somerville Avenue, heading east from Davis Square, it didn't go as a straight shot as we see right in front of us, all the way down to Medford Street. In other words, Bow Street on the other side of Bow Market was part of the original Somerville Avenue. And it was called Bow Street because it literally bowed out or swelled out, curved out, to avoid marshland that was on this side of Bow Street, that was associated with the Millers River, which is a river that is no longer visible. And that river would have been to further south of here by about a block or so. And Millers River started off of the Charles River on the south side of Charlestown, and it meandered kind of through in between Cambridge and Somerville, and it provided more of a visible boundary between Cambridge and Somerville. It was, further east, it was almost like two large ponds joined together, and then it very quickly at Prospect Street turned into almost more of a creek that meandered along the south side of the Union Square crossroads, and then kind of paralleled the Fitchburg tracks before eventually petering out further west. And what's happening with the Millers River is that all during the 1850s and 60s, the meatpacking companies, especially the North Company and the really big one, I'm having a senior moment, I apologize. It was like the biggest meatpacking of all. It'll come to me. Squires, how could I forget that? The Squires meatpacking. Squire is leading the way in polluting the Millers River. And he's, all the blood carcasses and all the gore from his meatpacking, which, by the way, straddled the East Cambridge, Somerville line, was being tossed into the river. And in 1869, the Massachusetts Board of Health was founded for at first, the sole purpose of studying the Millers River to see what could be done. And what they came up with was they would have to fill it in. So between the 1870s and almost up to 1900, they kept filling it in. And so the Millers River disappeared, although there are business owners who are kind of next to and over the path of the river who say that when they're down in their basements, they can hear the river running under their basements. So that's interesting. So anyway, what happens is in 1830, before the river is filled in, some of the wetlands are filled in. And so there were wetlands right in front of us where this piece of Somerville Avenue is. And so Somerville Ave became a straight shot from Carlton Street and Bow down there all the way east to Medford Street. That's all a new 1830 straight shot kind of avenue. And then post 1830, then you very slowly get buildings constructed along the length here. And probably the oldest building that still stands goes back to 1860, the Cyrus A. Bent House here of about 1860, which was built for a man who was the superintendent of a meatpacking company, probably Squires. And so here you have an Italianate house that shows this Somerville obsession in the 1850s and 60s with the center gable. And you see lots of center gable Italianates, in the eastern half of the city. And here the gable is in the the center gable is in the form of an oriel, kind of like a bay with nothing under it that projects out, that gives you kind of a more formal design with the front door sheltered under it. And then an extensive L in the back that was added, as best we can tell, around 1900. So there's the Bent House here. And then across the street, going down to the New Asia restaurant building, that was off on the left. That was originally the Young Block, the JF Young Block, or the J some initial Young Block of about 1880. And I see it as a kind of harbinger of the substantial commercial residential buildings that will get built further down the street, down at Garrier Square, which I don't think many people call it that, but where Bow comes in up at that end at Somerville Ave, that it's kind of predicting that you're going to be getting these big boxy Italianate commercial residential buildings that in many cases have, you know, all the brackets that are synonymous with the Italianate, whether it's under the eaves or at the dormers or wherever they happen to be. And the thing about this stretch of Somerville Ave going right into the heart of Union Square further east is that there are a number of Victorian storefronts still intact, and this is, you know, it is to be encouraged to keep them being intact. And then across the street, the house with the end gable roof, that is about somewhere in the 1860s, 1870. A family named Turner lived there from about the time of the Civil War into the 1920s. And what you'll find is that after the 20s, a lot of the buildings are subdivided into apartments or further subdivided, and then you're getting Somerville Ave as home to immigrants, Irish, Italian, later Portuguese, Greek. In front of us, the J.J. Sullivan building started its life as the John Brenner Company building in 1910. So this is, I think, very early for a two-story concrete building. The use of concrete here is interesting. You know, concrete, the Romans invented in their ancient times, and it's revived in Britain in the mid-18th century during their Industrial Revolution, and then it pops up in New England 1850 and later. And a great oversized example of concrete design is the Harvard football stadium, 1903, which when it was built was the largest ferro-concrete structure in the world. When I say ferro, I mean reinforced with iron. And so here you've got early use of concrete for a commercial building, and Brenner's company was a kind of a hardware store that specialized in paint. So it was almost like a Sherwin-Williams or a Benjamin Moore, but with more things besides selling paint going on there. And you can see nice detail at the corners, the pilasters at either end with the very flowery, florid Corinthian capitals. You can think of pilasters as flattened out columns, purely decorative, not really supporting anything. And then a cornice that's pretty elaborate, a dental course, the part that almost looks like teeth up at the top near the roof. Very fancy classical revival commercial building.
So just to bring you into the current times, that building there, the J.J. Sullivan we just talked about, is actually destined for major redevelopment. The owner actually owns a fair amount of property there, not only this building, but next door, the parking lot that goes all the way back. And I believe that there is a proposal that's in the works right now by the owner working with developers to actually change that into retail on the first floor, commercial, which is what, just so you know, most of the new buildings that are going up in the city will have multi-use. The first floor will be either retail or commercial, and then upstairs will be the residential. It will never be just residential right up to the street. And that's what this is destined for as well. They just started to have neighborhood meetings on it, and I know there's a lot of people that are concerned because it's going to shape both this side of the street as well as Lake Street behind there as well. And we'll go there later and you'll see what a small, narrow street that is, and that's going to be at least a 3 or 4 story building. So And you also might notice that the buildings that Ed was just talking about, which are nicely multicolored painted and such, they came through a storefront improvement program that we had many years ago and actually brought out a lot of the details, which is very helpful, I think. It's an inexpensive way to actually show when you have a lot of architectural details on a house or a property. And this whole area here, we have been working with the property owners to encourage them, as Ed said, to retain those architecture, the original architecture, to restore it if it's not there anymore. The building right behind PAC Lounge here was one of the renovations that was done over 10, 15 years ago, which has now got Sally O'Brien's and a health center and such. There's a liquor store down there. So we have made some progress working with owners, and we hope to encourage to do that. And if those of you that are here today actually really believe in that's kind of the way to go to preserve some of these buildings and restore them, I urge you to talk to your alderman and the mayor about that, because they need to hear your feedback.
So here we are at a crossroads that in the late 19th century was called Post Office Square, because the building off to the right with the 1960-ish mesh screening, that is a late Victorian post office building, and we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. But we are at Garrier Square, which was named for two brothers who died during the First World War. And the post office square name, I guess, hung on for a while. I don't know what people call this today, but at any rate, across the street from us is the Drouet or Drouet block, which was built in the 1890s as a quite substantial commercial residential building by a very accomplished architect named Aaron Gould, who was born up in the Canadian Maritimes, up in Nova Scotia, and as a young man headed south first to Maine to pursue a career in architecture, and then ended up in the southern states for a time designing hotels, and then by the 1890s is in Somerville designing quite large wooden, and I think that's really key, wooden, because in other municipalities a building of this size would have been constructed of brick and stone or stone. But I suspect because the carpenters' trades were so strong here that that they would be the ones to prevail and have these buildings constructed of wood. And of course, building in wood is a lot cheaper than building in masonry materials. But whatever the case, Somerville has three quite large, important buildings along these lines. Yes, Drouet, but also around the corner on Bow, over where Summer Street comes in, there's the Richmond block. And then behind us is the Bennett block, which we don't know if that's an Aaron Gould building, but we think it is. But what I love about the Drouet block here is that you've got all this projecting ornamental detail, the window lintels and these sort of canopy-like wooden overhangs over the center windows, and it's just a really handsome building. And then turning, well, before we go to the Bennett block, I just want to talk about this little gas station, the City Services gas station of 1925, which was a fuel station whose clientele, we're told, were utilities. And I'm not exactly sure what that means, whether, I don't know, I don't know. Further research is needed here. But this ended up being part of a complex that included an automobile storage facility. There used to be two quite large gas tanks in that front parking area that people didn't love. But the main point is this little Colonial Revival gas station with the kind of graceful neo-federal arch, if you will, and the suggestion of fancy panels over the windows. And there used to be more of a cupola. I'm feeling like there's an envelope here that's missing. There was more to that cupola than I'm seeing now. But anyway, and then looking over, let's just...
Before you go there, I just also want to point out this building over here that you just mentioned, the 374, was actually the Star Theater before, which is one of the many what we call lost theaters of Somerville. One of the only remaining one that we have is actually in Davis Square, the Somerville Theater that I'm sure everybody knows of. But at one time, the theaters were a very important part of the cultural life of Somerville. Each of the different neighborhoods actually had one, and I'm told by people that used to go to them and lived here and grew up here, that's where they got a lot of their china. When you went, that was one of the sort of the gifts that they gave sometimes. And they have very fond memories that as kids, that's where they went on the weekends, and everybody had their own neighborhood theater, basically. There was one in East Somerville, they're all over, basically. None of them are still actively in use as such, and clearly this one isn't either. The kind of renovation that was done to it, you might say, in the 60s is not exactly what we call historic preservation. We're hoping that we can work with their new owners when about taking that down, but this was what this shows you what happens over time, and I think it's important because preservationists are often viewed as just wanting to return everything to exactly the way it was when it was first built. And this is just an evolution of building materials that people thought were in vogue and they really liked and they wanted to make changes to. So it's worth pointing out that this at one point somebody paid a lot of money to put that up there. Unlike vinyl siding, which or aluminum siding, often not only masks the structure, but it often covers up problems that you had with your building, and you just wanted, out of sight, out of mind, I won't deal with. Some of these kinds of facade alterations are more because they like that look better.
Some people might look at the theater now as having a mid-century modern screen. So if you really want to get the Victorian qualities of the former Star Theater, look along the Carlton Street side and you'll see a quite fancy corbelled out brickwork cornice with the little stepped out brick details. This was one of 14 theaters that were in Somerville between 1900 and 1950, and the Somerville Theater at Davis Square is the only one that's still active as a theater. So let's just kind of walk over here for a minute. We're looking at the William Bennett block of 1891, 1892, which was built by a man who had a heating and plumbing company in the L in the back of this building. So there were stores, still are, on the first floor, and then apartments that were home to Irish, Italian, and Greek families. And in fact, there's a Greek social club. You see the Greek flag over across the street that's still with us over on that side of the street, which speaks to what a melting pot Somerville Avenue was and is. And so the thing that I love about this Queen Anne commercial block are these triangular, it's almost like a Hollywood facade. There's nothing behind the triangular structures up at the top, in the front and alongside along on Carlton Street side. They're just there to add interest to the design. And not so long ago, they painted the facades, or I guess they're still in the, well, here we go, they're painting the facade as we speak. But they've managed to pick out the second floor windows, that detail that's bellflower and garlands in the kind of buff color with the maroon background. So this is all very encouraging, to say the least.
Yeah, this is an example again of a building that actually went through our storefront program back in the, I think, late 1980s, bringing out the details I said before with paint in particular. delighted to see that there are people up there right now that look like they're trying to preserve some of the woodwork there. This building has actually had a permit for many years from the Preservation Commission to actually be altered, although not taken down. There was a little bit of a controversy about this in a fight that we won. But they're actually they had a permit to actually take the lot next door, expand into it and such. That permit has run out some time ago, and there's now some other developers that are interested in doing some work here as well. So we're very hopeful that will continue. The Tiranock, just to point out, there's other buildings along here that over the years have been reinvested in, which obviously is what we're wanting to have happen. And there's nothing better than a transit station to come into Union Square to be the final catalyst for a lot more investment to occur. So again, if you're interested in this kind of stuff, I urge you to weigh in on this, because saving these buildings, converting them to new uses, expanding them and such, can all happen, like a lot of these buildings have, and not be knocked down if in fact there's public support for that.
Kilby Street was developed between 1890 and 1895, and the fact of the matter is that the south side of Somerville Ave historically has been full of these kind of dead-end cul-de-sacs. You can think of Bleachery, Cord, and Kent, and some of the others, and often it turned out that many of the Irish lived along these courts so that they could be near the factories that they worked in. Kilby Street, I think, has more of a melting pot story, as expressed in the two buildings that we're looking at, number 6 and number 10 next door on the right. Number 6 was long associated with German families who had names like Hess and Heinrich and a couple of others that I'm forgetting. And they did things like they were lab workers. You find out that in Union Square, after 1910, when MIT got set up in Cambridge, that you had a number of people from Union Square working at MIT, doing cleaning work in the MIT labs with, their equipment and so forth. So this was historically a German house, and next door historically was an Irish house, so that families like the Dugans and the Haggertys lived in that house up until the 1940s, and then after 1940 a Portuguese family owns that house until recent times. And then as we go further down, so then around 1900, this 6 or more families building was put up. You can think of this as an oversized 3-decker that's involving many more units, tucked away back here with quite an impressive door hood still intact over the main entrance. It's interesting back here.
Okay, this is the kind of thing that we like to do on walking tours when you come on local ones, is to show you sort of the shortcuts. And there's a name for these. I think they're called sniglets. So this is not official.
We are on Lake Street in an enclave that is surrounded by major traffic arteries: Washington Street, Somerville Ave, Hawkins Street, a block down, not so major, but these are kind of the boundaries. And it's a fascinating area of small-scale, late 19th, early 20th century buildings that I think are worth knowing about and hanging on to. There was an Alice Lake who was somehow related to the Hawkins family, who were the big landowners on the south side of Somerville Avenue. And their land stretched across the other side of Washington Street behind us. And the main lake house or Lake Hawkins house was further west on this street, sort of between Carlton and where the family market basket is. And it was a big house set back from Somerville Ave with a lot of stables in the back. and it was eventually moved in the early 1900s and is now part of a parking lot. So, but what we have with us now is Olive Square, which is just really, really charming. These little attached Italianate row houses. I think we're missing a couple on the left side further down that were built between 1880 and 1884. And again, you know, home to, this wasn't company housing. There wasn't a specific factory owning these buildings. These were, you know, some American tube workers and some meatpacking folks and some Union Glass folks, and you look at the directories and, you know, you get the drift that they are going to be able to walk to where they work.
This is a part of Somerville that I think a lot of people don't know about. Olive Square, if you ask them where it is, people that lived there all their lives could not tell you where it is. So you are now in the know. And it is also very reflective of a part of Somerville that we're losing, which is the kind of small village-like areas, and I think a lot of people don't want to see that happen. So that's one of the reasons we wanted to bring you here today. I also want you just to turn around briefly and look at a view that you don't often get to see, which is, this is the back of the police station up there. If you look at the top of the building there with that parapet there, that's something that we went to great lengths to work with the developer the city owned that building for many, many years. It was a police station at one point and then used for community services. And we worked with the developers to restore that. So that's just one example of a really wonderful preservation job that I think people have no idea about. On this, right here in front of us is this J.J. Sullivan, that building there, and I was talking to you about before. This is the site that I was mentioning is going to radically change and be redeveloped with probably a lot of housing, and as I said, commercial on the first floor. The building on the right, which is a garage at Hawkins Street there, I think is also destined to be removed. It's nothing definite yet, but there is rumors afoot that there are developers that are interested in that as well, that whole block there. So this side of Lake Street is going to very much change, it looks like. And if you look down to your left, just to get your bearings, that's basically Market Basket up there in the parking lot. So this is an area that's ripe for lots of redevelopment. So Olive Square, which we're looking at now, is pretty cool for a lot of reasons, one of which, as I said, is the type of uses that are there, but also there is actually 3 buildings here which are all interconnected below ground, which I only discovered after poking around and talking to some people and such. So we have the opportunity to go in the building and show you what most people don't get to see. This building, and Ed's going to tell you a lot about the history of it, and it's got a lot of interesting history at that. But right now, it has become kind of an incubator space for a lot of other businesses as well, a whole different variety and different floors. We're going to go through the building. I've arranged with an architectural firm that's only been there for a couple of months to let us in. They actually moved from Cambridge, which is often happening these days, and they actually sublease their space to another really interesting business that I think that hopefully she'll talk to you about. But the developer of this building, or the owner, is Riverside Corporation. They own a fair amount of property throughout Massachusetts. They're a big firm and such. This is one of their, what I'll call, cooler buildings in their portfolio. They also recently bought another building over on Windsor Street where Taza Chocolate is. I'm sure everybody at least knows where that is. Yeah. So that's also a building with a lot of funky uses in there and such. So this is kind of their part of the portfolio I like to think of as being a little bit more diverse than the typical kinds of commercial stuff they have in suburban office parks and such. So I've talked with the developer, and unfortunately he was going to be here today to talk with you all and talk to you about the concept and what they're doing and such. But he and his wife just had their second baby a little early. So he just contacted me yesterday and said it's just not going to happen for obvious reasons. So I'm asking the architect, Elizabeth, to take us through here and tell us the little that she knows about it, having been newly moved in here. So we're going to go inside, and on the right-hand side, which I don't know if they're here, but Metro Pedal Power, you might have seen them riding around in their bicycles, and they transport people's food and other goods all over on a bicycle all year round. Wednesday Jane is the owner, and she was going to try and be here today as well to show you and talk to you a little bit about her business. She's one of the older tenants in the building now remaining. There's some others, a Moroccan and some others as well, but they're not around, so.
So are we heading in?
So we're going to head in over there. Yes.
Beautiful.
This started out its life in the 1870s as the Eagle Roller Shade Company. And in 1886, the Roller Shade Company moved out, and I.H. Brown woodworking shop moved in. And I.H. Brown was a very well-known company in its day that, yes, specialized in fancy paneling for high-end houses and businesses. But one of its major claims to fame was that it made the old wood and glass cases for museums. The Agassiz Natural History Museum, the Peabody Museum complex at Harvard University. There's still a room, the Hall of Mammals, that has cases made by I.H. Brown. So that's what you're about to walk into, a place that was a very, very reputable, well-known woodworking outfit that moved here after a fire destroyed their original factory in Cambridge, and then they moved over here in 1886.
This is Elizabeth Christopheretti, and she is the owner, principal in the architectural firm that has recently moved here. I've asked her to talk a little bit about some of the businesses that are here, why she came, and what she can tell us about the building. As an architect, she's very well aware of the kind of craziness of the maze of space here.
What's your firm's name?
Yeah, so
Elizabeth
Christopheretti, and my firm's name is called Supernormal. And we're a kind of funny firm in that we spun out of the Media Lab at MIT a few years ago and ended up at an incubator with a couple of other MIT spin-outs from various labs. We actually cohabitate now with another company, a consumer products company called Ember Labs, who's developing a wearable heating and cooling bracelet, which is a very cool product. So we've kind of all traveled together from the Kendall area over to here, and we moved in a few months ago. Are you guys coming in? You're going to come in?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so you'll see when you come in that we are still very much moving in. We've been very busy, but very happy here because it allowed us to expand quite a bit and have a bit more room to breathe. So we're now, you're going to see a bunch of boxes in there because we've got 2 projects happening over at Bow Market, and we're storing a bunch of stuff here for our clients. So we do a lot of design, we do planning, we do traditional architecture work. We also get very involved in things like big data analytics around urban environments, and try to apply emerging technologies in a kind of an appropriately qualitative and place-based way to design. So we're also very happy to be here, and we found out about the place because our friends, some landscape architects, Shauna Gillies-Smith from a company called Ground was here, and she had recommended that we come on over and look at it, and we might be able to afford it. And it's true, we could. And it turns out that we actually knew some of the other companies in here as well. So we've been really happy here, and we're really pleased to be in Union. It's an awesome location.
and some of the other businesses here, the Recover Green Moves, you might
Yep.
want to mention. These are all kind of emerging new companies that have come to Somerville, which we're delighted to have. And I think that they often have a lot of a symbiotic relationship with each other because they're in close spaces, literally. They get to know what each other do, and then they can pull each other in on various projects and such. So
Yeah, so Foray is a design studio over here, and Foray and Recover Green Roofs actually share some space as well. Our space here, before we got here, used to be an artists' collaborative, or it was a cooperative in a way. So it housed a lot of different really fantastic companies and emerging groups, breweries, so on and so forth. And Recover and Foray both spun out of that and kind of then took on larger spaces. The group down here is a bike delivery company with a really remarkable founder who's also been here for quite a long time. So we're really the newcomers in town in a lot of ways here. Everyone else has kind of been around, but I think we all interestingly share some kind of value system, and it's true, you know, there's some kind of symbiosis that happens.
Great. So this is a little confusing, I have to warn you, and we're going to actually go through more than just your space, because I just think it's fascinating how this building is all, as I said, interconnected. And so I don't know how you want to start us off. But,
Sure.
okay?
Okay, so you're going to come in the space, and we're going to be over here in the middle, and you're going to kind of see a bunch of boxes and some kind of random things. You'll see some photographs of products from Ember Labs, and then I'll take you kind of all the way down here and then lead you out into the common area. There's another company called John G. Who moved in just a little bit before us. It's doing running apparel, so you'll see them on the same floor as us. And then I guess upstairs, we're going to go upstairs too, and you kind of see the hallways there, which is where Recover and Ground and the whole kind of landscape crew resides. And the bike delivery company is down here. Lots of different stuff here. We have a lot of shared space. There's a shared conference room here. You'll see, you might want to poke your head around this way over here. This is a shared kind of lounge area that we have attached to what used to be a loading dock. Got some hammocks and that kind of good stuff in there. And we'll go out here, and you'll also see the conference spaces here. So, I mean, the things that we do here are pretty wide-ranging. We have a lot of meetings. We build models in our space. We do a lot of drawing, so we have messy desks everywhere. We don't have very many clients right now, as you can see, for good reason.
Yeah.
It's a bit messy. So we try to, look as professional as we can. That doesn't always work.
And needless to say, they're very busy because she's here on a Sunday working.
Oh, yeah. No, the problem isn't lack of clients. It's that we don't want to have them here because we're so messy. Too many building things. So come on through.
So you can see here, this is where they do a lot of their meeting with other people and such. And so they're in the throes of putting it all together. And they've done a great job since I was here 2 months ago. And it's amazing how quickly you have to pull these things together when you've got a lot of work going on at the same time. But we did a Jane's Walk here as well in May. And so I wanted to share this with other people again. So thank you so much for doing this.
Asked about the construction, and
Where's Ed?
There's a contractor here who renovated portions of this building, who we actually work with on another separate institutional project in another location. And they've done a really good job. They've kind of selectively improved it. So our space was improved minimally, as in not so much. We just threw up some walls when we came in, whereas John G. and Ground upstairs have been more kind of aggressively improved, I would say, with correlating rents, I should imagine. And so, you can see here it's true that it's quite, in a really good and productive way cobbled together, and it leads to many different qualities within the same building.
Yeah, so this is an example of lots of different size and types of firms all sort of working together in one building, which is Ed, have you actually haven't talked about the building, or
I talked before.
But did it? Okay, good. So I just missed that part. So this is sort of a continuation of its past, when it was actually a maker space, if you will, and that's what a lot of these businesses are. And it's what we're also encouraging in Somerville. Goes back to our original history, where there were a lot of artisans and craftspeople that built these houses around here and did this wonderful architecture. So moving forward into the more high-tech period that we're in right now, the emerging technology, it's all part of a nice continuum here. So I think it's pretty exciting to see buildings like this that have these kinds of uses, smaller firms that are growing, employing more and more people, doing some pretty cool innovations and such, now all working together in these older buildings, and allows us to preserve them. The key thing is also trying to keep them affordable, and so I'm sorry the developer isn't here today, because he and I have had long discussions about that, and they are trying to, to work in that context. But they are a profit-making business, and they have to make money, and to pay for these renovations and all the things they've done, needless to say, the rents are going up. So fairness. So for those of you that like to, I think I'm just going to ask if some people can go back to the building. We're just going to go upstairs, and we're going to come out on the Washington Street side just to get a sense of yet another kind of part of the building. If you don't want to do that part, I totally understand, and we'll just meet you right up on the corner there to go across the bridge. saying that for those of you that have walked by this a million times before and maybe have kids at the school across the street, you probably had no idea that there was this kind of configuration inside. And that it has 3 different entries, and it's been altered and renovated in various different materials. There's brick here, and there's wood down there, and a lot of glass on the other side, as you saw. So this is, again, we're going to go heading now into Union Square a little bit to talk further about some of the church down there, I think.
Yeah. I know it is. I know. What we're looking at is the back of the sanctuary of the former St. Thomas Episcopal Church. And this is kind of like the hidden church of Union Square. A friend of mine who'd been married to an Episcopal priest and had worked in churches forever and ever, she said to me, there couldn't possibly be an Episcopal church in Union Square. But yes, here it is. And it was built in the early 1870s. It was a spin-off from St. John's Episcopal Church on Devon Street in Charlestown. And they came over here, Reverend George Durrell, and they hired a high-end kind of church furnishings, carpentry, decorating outfit to do the pews and different things. And I have not been in there because it's not been particularly accessible in recent years. It was a church until about 1960, and then it became home to social service agencies and different things. So it's, unlike St. Joseph, which is perhaps the most prominent landmark in Union Square, here we have the hidden landmark that's well worth trying to find if you're ever out for an evening stroll or something like that. So, and this, grew in several stages, and some of it dates to the 19-teens, and then in 1960, that was the end of the congregation, just dwindled, and that was it. So,
the front of the church.
so the front of the church, thank you, is on Somerville Avenue. And even at that, I think the front of the church has sort of a commercial vibe to it. So you don't notice it either, at either end, you don't really know that it's there.
It's a brick front. It's a brick
Yeah,
front.
it's been a later brick front.
It doesn't look at all like a church. It's actually a brick in the front. It's actually, I think, only 1.5 stories tall and such. So this is totally hidden as well as unexpected. So,
The store?
oh, the actual store. I don't even know that it has one anymore. It's had a lot of different uses in there, and so I don't know what the name is actually.
Presumably it looked like a church when it was
It did.
first built.
It did.
Actually
Oh, it was
and
a-
it had more of a tower coming out the top of it. Yep.
So I also want to mention while we're standing here on this side of the street, this is again Washington Street that goes, and if you keep going up this hill past the school, you go into Cambridge. So it's right on the border. Ultimately becomes permanent, but that's a ways up, right? But right next door here, if you want to know, this is the Ward 2 recently elected on last election alderman's house. This is J.T. Scott's house, where he lives, as well as has, I think, a couple businesses he rents to as well. And on the other side is the funeral home that was a funeral home, is no longer, is being renovated. Again, residential as well upstairs and commercial downstairs. And then there's another building there as well. So they're going to be very close together, and it's under construction right now, as I'm sure you just noticed. So again, this is an area that's going through a lot of changes as well. And then Ed's going to talk to you about the church and over here as well. And then the school, as on the right-hand side, which we'll go by later from the other aspect, is a major renovation, a major reconstruction job that we did about 3 years ago.
We're now on Kingman Road, originally known as Kingman Court. And Kingman Road's claim to fame was over in this kind of undeveloped area was a company called Kingman and Hamlin Wooden Pump Company. And they were founded in 1845. And they were, what brought them here was the fact that the railroad was in place in 1842, both freight rail and for passengers. And so they were taking advantage of proximity to the railroad, Fitchburg Railroad, that could move their products around. And Kingland and Hamlin owned houses that faced Washington Street that stood on the site of where the late Victorian school is up at the corner. And, this is an example, was an example of some of the smaller industries, some of the smaller wood shops and foundries. It wasn't just only monolithic meat packing and glass making and tube works and all of that, that there was quite a healthy showing of these smaller industries that were along here. And then over here you have a row, I think numbers 6 through 20, Kingman Road, that were built between 1870 and 74. And they are, this row is a good example of a hip on mansard row. We're not exactly standing at an optimal angle to see the hip part, but as we walk back up the street, look back, that there's this additional taller hip part of the roof that's atop this mansard lower part. And the mansard roof has an interesting evolution. It's introduced to the Boston area in 1847 on Washington Street in the south end of Boston at East Concord and Washington Street at something called the Deacon or Decon Mansion that literally had a French architect for a house that had a French mansard roof. And then by the 1850s and 60s, particularly in the Back Bay, the mansard roof began to proliferate. And at first it was what was called a bell cast profile, where it would be like literally looking at the profile of something like the Liberty Bell or some other bell, low slung, not a lot of headroom. And over time people found that they wanted to have more room for their servants in the high-end houses, for their kids, for all kinds of reasons. And so the 1870s was the great age of the hip on mansard roof, which this row beautifully exemplifies. And there's, the Italianate thrown in as seen in these polygonal bays that project out on either side of the entrances, and interesting kind of recessed dormers. It's just a great survival from 1870s Union Square. In the heart of Union Square here, we're talking about St. Joseph's Roman Catholic Church here on the corner, which was built between 1870 and 1874. Until St. Joseph's was completed in 1874, Charlestown's Somerville's Roman Catholics, and there were 2,000 Roman Catholics in the city by 1870, but with no place to worship. And they would have to walk into the churches of Charlestown or Cambridge to go to church. And so a bit of prejudice, frankly, against the Irish was somewhat overcome enough to be able to build this church in 1870 to 74. And like many churches, the basement is completed first and a roof put over it in anticipation of the rest of the church, so that there could be worship services in the basement at first, and then moving upstairs when the rest of the church is completed. The early, initially the church services were held across the street where there's that modern low-rise commercial business. That was a very important first commercial building in the square, 1869. The Masonic block, the Masons Hall was located there, a Gothic Revival building that was torn down. I'm not exactly sure when, probably early 20th century or something, but at any rate, St. Joseph's is the major landmark in the square. Its first pastor, who's Monsignor McGrath, was with the church for 63 years, okay, from the early 1870s well into the 20th century. And he and a Cambridge Catholic priest, Maguire, the highway, the McGrath and O'Brien Highway, is named for these priests. So it's probably the only segment of a major highway named for the Roman Catholic clergy in this country. So that's kind of interesting. The church suffered some damage during the hurricane of 1938, and then in 1978, the steeple was taken down because it was declared structurally unsound. So it's a good example of the Gothic Revival style, obviously from all the pointed arches that you see, and the great rose window in the center up there of the gable, and a very handsome church. And so we're now, we have a little bit of a time crunch here, so we're going to turn the corner and walk up Webster Avenue.
And before we do, I just want to point out that this is actually one of the few designated structures in Union Square as a historic structure, as one of the few churches that we were able to designate. They don't have their plaque up, unfortunately, but this is, as he said, one of the major landmarks in Union Square that's remaining. So it's very important. There's a couple of others on the other side of the square we're not going to be talking about today, other than the ones we did, but this is a designated structure.
Okay, so looking down into the tracks on the right was the site of the original Union Square Fitchburg Railroad Station, the old wooden station. You used to be able to see stone steps that went down to the station site, which I think are now, hidden under all the foliage and so forth. But the new Union Square station, when the train comes into the square in 2021, is going to be on Prospect Street near where?
It'll be at Prospect Street just as you're coming out of the square and along the bridge there. That's actually where it's, before it gets to the top there.
Okay.
It's image number 3 that you're looking at for the old station.
Right. And then across Webster Avenue here, on the other side of all that electrical business, was the site of the Union Glass Works, which was founded in 1854 and was in business into the 1920s. And this was, known nationally, internationally, at various points the largest employer of workers in the city. And it was founded by Cambridge men, the Houghtons, who were manufacturing flint glass, particularly lanterns. They were famous for their railroad signal lanterns, but all kinds of things like glass doorknobs and panes of glass and any kind of glass product you can think of, they made. And they had these enormous kind of kilns and chimneys on the property, and there are very few photographs of this. Union Glass eventually can be thought of as the father of Corning Glass in upstate New York. Corning Glass up in Ithaca has its roots in the glass factories of East Cambridge and Union Square, Somerville. It is known that the Houghton brothers named their company Union because they wanted it known that they were supporters of the Union cause. And that's another reason why Union Square may be called Union Square. There's also another thought that there was a recruiting station, an army recruiting station for Union soldiers in the square. So that's another possible source for the Union name, because before Union it was called Liberty Pole Square, because firemen in the area in the 1850s put up a flagpole right in the center of the square, and before that it was called Sandpit Square in recognition of the fact that there were brickyards in this general area because the silica in the ground was very good for making bricks, and the fact that it was near waterways, in this case the Millers River, and brickyards over along the Mystic and so on. In the 1880s, Union flips ownership and it becomes owned by a man named Julian de Cordova, who goes into the making of art glass pretty exclusively. And he is the founder of the de Cordova Museum in Lincoln, which I think that was his house. He lived to be a very old man over there by the shores of whatever that lake is that his museum is next to. We have just turned on to Clark Street, and when you look at the 1852 map, instead of Clark Street, you have a driveway that follows part of the path of the street, and the driveway led to this house, this Greek Revival house with the pedimented attic and the very Greek Revival entrance surrounds. There used to be more of a suggestion of pilasters and more detail to the entablature above the pilasters. But this is the oldest house on the street. It was built for a man named Joseph Clark, whose job description is bookkeeper. And he did not apparently live in this house. He rented it out. He lived on Elm Street Court, which I've been meaning to try to figure out if that cul-de-sac still exists off of Elm Street, presumably, yes. Okay, and the next street over is called Joseph. So you have Joseph and Clark after the early developer of this street. And then as we walk down, you'll notice that the houses on this east side are relatively early for this area. You know, this house is probably mid-1840s. The other houses are 1850s. When you look at the opposite side of the street, we're talking a much, well, not a much later, but a later development, 1880s to early 1900s. And that's how these streets develop. One street, for whatever reason, is going to be developed early, and in the beginning looking out onto a field, and then 20 years go by and the other houses come along. So let's head down Clark. One of these days I'll find out the story on this house, which looks even older than the Joseph Clark house and was apparently moved here in the 1880s, but from where? And it looks very much like the kind of house you see in East Cambridge over, you know, in the courthouse, Middlesex County Courthouse area. So that was, well, it definitely was moved there. And then over here on the right is the third of three double houses. And this house is in near original condition. The others have had alterations here and there, but you can see the beautiful simplicity of the way the front doors are set off by the side lights and the transoms, the rectangular multi-pane transom. You know, this is really a Greek Revival Italianate hybrid. The orientation to the street is Italianate. Some of the details are Greek Revival, like the side lights. Way back, Clark Street came to a screeching halt about where we're standing because part of the Millers River flowed along here. This was part of where the river was located. And again, not a wide roaring river, but really more of a creek. On the other side of the Millers was the George Wyatt Brickyard, which is where Lincoln Park is today. And that brickyard was founded in 1850, and it went out of business somewhere around the 1890 or so. And in Somerville, the story of the brickyard started up around 1820. And as some of you may know, Medford has had a long history as a brick making place going back to the mid-17th century. And so Somerville's, brick making goes back to about 1820 on the north side of Broadway, where eventually there would be Jake's Brickyards and all of that. So down here, there was the Wyatt family brickyard. And when you look at the old atlases from the 1870s and 80s, you will notice that on the Washington Street side of their brickyards, there was a very long shed that was like a storage facility for storing the bricks until they were shipped to building sites. And then in front of the shed were, I don't know, maybe 7, as many as 9 kilns with associated chimneys where the bricks were fired up. And these brickyards presented a really bleak landscape because there's this pit digging of the soil aspect, leaving scars in the land. There was even a little pond over on the, on the western part of the brickyard that was somehow part of the brick story. Okay, so the Wyatts go out of business, and then in the mid-1890s, they, meaning the powers that be at City Hall, start talking about getting a park on the site of the brickyards. And, parks were an idea that was slow to be embraced by the city of Somerville. The very first one was 1870 to 71 up on Central Hill, where the municipal buildings are in the City Hall. That has become a kind of a campus for those buildings, and that is called Central Park. And then along comes Foss Park in 1874. Part of it, it's north of Broadway, on Broadway. Part of it's in East Somerville. Part of it's in the Ten Hills neighborhood. That's 1874. And then in the 1890s, it's like people heard an alarm clock ringing, and if they didn't create parks, they were never going to. And so you get Prospect Hill Park at the turn of the 20th century. A little bit earlier than that, Nathan Tufts Park at Powder House in actually the early 1890s to mid-1890s. The former Nathan Tufts and Pickle Manufacturing Company site. Somerville is late to embracing parks, but now, yes, we still have Lincoln Park, but we have the latest and the greatest and a really wonderful, brilliantly designed park that we're going to walk through eventually. Do you want to say anything about it? Yep.
Yeah, he's absolutely right that Somerville has a dearth of open green space, and I don't think I need to say anybody that lives here hasn't noticed that. But we've been trying really hard over the last couple of decades to remedy that. The current mayor especially has designated some more spaces as well and purchased. Lincoln Park has just been totally redone. As you probably will see here, it's actually got some new fields that have been presented here on both sides that are not open yet. But this park here, we're going to walk through quickly because of timing. But I do hope you'll come back because it's a wonderful recreational area for both passive and open space that we just completed and opened this summer. The fields will be opening not until next spring because we're trying to give them a chance for the grass to really grow. This is grass. There was a huge controversy, I might say, in the neighborhood about grass versus turf, and the grass people won. As a soccer mom, I have to say there's a lot of people in the community that are disappointed because this does not last if people play on it 24/7, which is what happens in Somerville. So it remains to be seen how long this is going to last. But we're trying to get it so that the grass really takes hold by keeping it laying fallow for basically a year. And so we'll see both fields. This is soccer and softball as well. I also want to say that this is a very innovative park, like many of the things we do in Somerville that we're very proud of, in the sense that it has a lot of new features in it. most of which we're not going to be able to see today because of timing and the kids aren't actually on it. But I do want to point out that there's now a skateboard park over there, a facility, as well as parkour, which we've become very well known for in the city as the only place in this area that actually offers parkour in a municipal facility. And that's over on the left there, and it's been both been very well utilized. They had a big opening this summer, and ever since then it seems like it's nonstop activity. The playground equipment is all new and state-of-the-art. Plus, the irrigation system here is all pretty special because it's all the water that's on the site actually goes back to the ground from the roofs, and all the surfaces around here goes back into the irrigation system to irrigate the fields and such. And so we've put a lot of effort into the greening part of the park as well. So we're going to sort of take a shortcut through the park right across here to save some time. But at the other side, we are going to point out one of the houses over there in the variety store. So.
Oh, okay. The house closest to us on the left, I think it's 17 Fremont Street. In the back is a wooden structure that back in the 1930s, 40s, into the 50s was much, I guess you could say, loved in the neighborhood because ice cream was sold from that wooden structure to the kids using the park, and it was also a variety store and that kind of thing. So somehow that has held on, and I don't know whether it's being used for housing or what, but
I can add to that. Actually, this is the house of the Alderman at Large, Stephanie Hirsch, who unfortunately could not be here today. She was on the last walk that we did, but she's got a crazy life. But they have used that and turned it into a playroom, basically, for their kids. And she has 3 children. So it actually still has a lot of people coming and going out of it as well. And she's very proud of it. They have some of the original signage that she found back from the variety store days. And then also, as you go down the street, which we're going to go to, this is actually another example of a, kind of a closely settled street that most people have never come down, that's right off the park. They have a memorial here to a couple of people that were really actively involved in the Lincoln Park area as well, so the community's been very involved in planning this park.
okay, so we're going to take a quick stroll down Fremont Street so that you can see on the left these little Queen Anne cottages that were built 1890 to 1895, a mix of Irish, English families in the beginning. Some of them have their original porches with the square and or turn post porches. One of them even has a king post up at the attic. And it's just a really charming enclave. We're about to step into what was part of the Hawkins estate that we talked a little about over on Lake and Olive. And this, extended over Washington Street into this area. And it was like the Hawkins were the holdouts. They didn't want this to be part of a public park. So they would rather develop with house lots. We are looking over here at 321 Washington Street, which is the last of the Fresh Pond Ice Company buildings. And yes, this related to the actual Fresh Pond on the Cambridge-Belmont line. And what's happening here is that Fresh Pond Ice was a late entry to the Fresh Pond Cambridge ice industry. Famously in 1840, Frederick Tudor had his Boston Ice Company. He's the one that started the harvesting of ice from ponds around Boston and shipping them to primarily the Charlestown waterfront to be put into ships, the tall ships that had tin-lined holes. The ice was packed in straw, and reportedly it could make the long voyages intact to the West Indies and even as far away as Calcutta in India. And so Frederick Tudor was there in the beginning, and then Fresh Pond gets into the act, but only briefly, because around 1890, the city of Cambridge decides that it wants Fresh Pond to be for drinking water and no longer for a place that has an ice company and a resort hotel. And so Fresh Pond company that's set up here as a distribution center. This is important. The Frederick Tudor business had an international trade. Fresh Pond was always very local, and its its large fleet of horse-drawn ice trucks went, all over the eastern Massachusetts area because by that time there was something called the Eddy Icebox that was invented in Dorchester around 1870, and it was where you could put a block of ice inside a kind of a cupboard-like feature in an old icebox. And so, this was all very local. And what happens when they lose Fresh Pond here is they, very interestingly, have their ice production on a pond up in New Hampshire, up in a place called Brookline, New Hampshire. And they ship the ice all the way down from New Hampshire. And this is one of the stopping off places still, for them for the ice to be loaded up into horse-drawn carts and taken out into the neighborhoods. So they will last until the mid-1930s, pretty long. And today this is a wonderful art center, and I have seen the Somerville Toy Camera Festival at Brick Bottom, I think last year, and it's a really fabulous, it's like very, I don't know, I hate the word artsy, but it's, you're taking, what you can take with a toy camera, and it comes out looking very cool. So I would recommend that you see that. So now, without further ado, let's head over to Aeronaut. Yay. We've earned our keep.
Okay, so I also want to mention while we're walking along, because we're going to really not stroll but walk briskly, but we're going to go by what's called a local historic district in Somerville on Dane Street, which we're not going to talk a lot about, but there have been a number of houses that have been designated there. And also then we're going to go down a street that's called Tyler Street, which we have renamed or dubbed Innovation Row because there are a lot of newer businesses that have come along there. It's the former envelope section, and it's actually where American Tube Works was that Ed mentioned before. He'll talk very briefly about, but those buildings have all been converted to new uses, and a lot of them, and most of them are kind of innovative ones. So we're going to just go quickly down that to get to Aeronaut within about 5 minutes. Okay, this is the part of the tour that we make you walk really fast so you feel totally justified having a pint of beer at the other end and feel like you've justified your your exercise today on the walking tour. So thank you so much for being so willing to move along. So this is the last part of the tour, and we are going to go down this street over here, which is Tyler Street, although it doesn't have a sign there. And before that, we're just going to point out over here on their left-hand side, this is where Greentown Labs started their business here. When they first came here, they were in Boston and then in Cambridge, and then we scooped them up. And they are very happy to be here in Somerville, and so happy and so popular in terms of the number of spaces they had. They're an energy incubator space for a lot of different businesses that they had such a long waiting list that they actually acquired a second building, which is the one on the left that you see the yellow railings up there, and that's the former building that was used for NACO auto parts and such, and they've taken that over and totally renovated it and such. Greentown, the other building, the original, is on the right-hand side there. This is a former street. It's called Frost Street, and Ed's going to talk very briefly about what the significance is.
So the brick buildings over here on the left were all part of the American Tube Works. The company was organized in 1851 for the purpose of making seamless copper and brass tubes for the railroads, steamships, for pipes for sanitation systems, for you name it. This was the first outfit of its kind in the United States. The founders of the company went to Britain to study a very similar operation, and over in Britain, unlike with the textile industry, they were very generous and gave them, blueprints and everything they needed to start something here in the States. And so this has gone through two different changes in terms of the buildings. The original 1850s buildings are all gone, but the buildings from the 1890 to 1920 era are what you see still today. So they were so successful that they needed to tear themselves down and build anew so that they could accommodate advancements in technology or whatever the case was. So, American Tube was a very important employer here in the Boston area. And then in 1938, it became the Ames Safety Envelope Company, which was in business here up until recent times, 2010. A business that, yes, had high-quality stationery products, but also kind of invented the color-coded filing system that many, many hospitals used, and other innovative products. And so, shall we leave it at that?
Not totally. So basically, they were actually bought out by another company in the Midwest, and they are no longer here. They then converted or used all these buildings to become part of Ames Business Park, which you just saw some signage when you went by. You'll still see up. In the very recent past, within the last year, they have been bought out as well. Ames Business Park, that is, the former owners, by a Chinese company, investors, and they are actually going through a lot of changes right now, and we're hoping they're going to keep a lot of what's here, which is these innovative businesses I mentioned. There's the Artisans Asylum, of course, Greentown Labs that I mentioned over here, and the Brooklyn Boulders rock climbing gym. There's actually, Harvard has a facility here as well for storage and things, and I'm missing a business.
I think it's MIT.
It's MIT, you're right, it's MIT. And there's another building that's down there that, oh, of course, Aeronaut, where we're going. And Aeronaut space is pretty cool because it's not only a brewery, but they have a lot of kind of open common space there that they've been working on with the city for some time to actually lease out and use for other uses as well, which is where we're going to actually have some refreshments. But in part of that, there's something called Tasting Counter, which is a kind of a high-end restaurant area where you can watch your food being made right in front of you. So anyway, all these businesses along here are pretty new to the city and are all sort of growing, and we're very pleased about that because it gave them initially a very affordable space, which of course is now under new ownership, so remains to be seen. I hope you enjoy the space here. It's pretty cool. And if you haven't been here before, there's a whole slew of different types of craft brews, many of which are become favorites of people throughout the Boston metropolitan area. Ed, you want to add anything to this?
Let's go in and have a good time. Thank you all for coming out today.